The Chinoy culture has always been known for being rich and vibrant, and a big aspect that contributes to our legacy is
There's a lot of history to behold at Bahay Chinoy. So in an effort to learn more about our roots, I went for a tour with the help of Miss Maya Ang C.
Start.
So this is the area of the Sanglai. So they refer to the Chinese during the Spanish period, those who come here often.
yes.
The Sanglai, when they came here, because of the same reasons that our OFWs leave the Philippines. These are things that you don't see in history books, but it's part of history books. The colonial economy during the Spanish period, if it weren't for the Chinese, it wouldn't run. So why is it not in our history books? Maybe because they're foreigners.
Yeah.
The Spanish period, they were Sanglai. They come here to work, then they go back to China. This extends all the way to the American period. The primary difference is that during the American period, there was a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the law says, if you are Chinese and you're coming here, you have to be a merchant or a son of merchant. And then they call themselves the Huaqiao, because they are migrants. They really are OCW, overseas Chinese workers. There's a lot of misconception that the Chinese are all in business. Diba? It is not a racial thing. It's a law thing.
It was a law.
We have a lot of famous people here in the Philippines who actually have Chinese lineage. No, Jaime Cardinal Sin, no, Cory Aquino, they contribute so much to the Philippines in general, but not because of their Chinese lineage. It's really because they are Filipinos. So at this point, they are now foreign. No, you have foreign like you and me, we're Chinoy. We are no longer Huaqiao because we're not going back to China. Chinoy is actually a term that our organization invented in the 1990s. We needed a term to reflect our identity as a people, that we are Filipino, but we do have a Chinese cultural background that we celebrate, that we recognize and celebrate. And so we came up with Chinoy.
That's nice. Wow. It really makes you appreciate everything all the more and understand.
Yes.
Who knew our history was that extensive and rich? From being immigrants for most of our history to being full-fledged Filipinos in the 70s. Learning about our history truly puts being a Chinoy in a whole new light and is nothing short of amazing.
Established in 1999 by the Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran Incorporated, the Kaisa Heritage Center, or better known as Bahay Chinoy, was a project advocating the historical and cultural legacy of Chinese Filipinos in the Philippines.
In the museum, you would see how the Chinese influenced the Filipinos in different aspects of the Philippine life, as far as culture, food, languages, okay? And we were part of each important event in the Philippine history. So we started with how the Chinese came to the Philippines as traders first, and later migrated to the Philippines because they were experiencing famine in China, and later immersed with the people, and a lot of them decided to bring in their family.
Promoting and hastening the integration of the Chinoys in the community and bridging the understanding of the mainstream Philippine society to the Chinese community are also among the main objectives of Bahay Chinoy.
The importance of this museum is we want to tell the Filipinos that the Chinoys are actually Filipinos foremost, but with Chinese descent. We are part of the whole community. And in this museum, you could see that in every aspect of Philippine life, the Chinese participated.
Besides the wax figures depicting the Chinoy history, the museum also houses gallery of rare prints and photographs depicting the old Chinese occupations, as well as a library and research and data bank that contains a collection of current research materials.
Bahay Chinoy is one of the very rare museums in Southeast Asia that features the local Chinese Filipinos. So a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia would have Chinese museum, but Bahay Chinoy is not a Chinese museum. It's a Filipino museum. So what you see here is Philippine history, but of course we highlight the aspect where the Chinese gave a very important influence.
Now let's explore more on what to see inside Bahay Chinoy.
Our tour here in Bahay Chinoy is very informative. I didn't actually expect to learn a lot. And it's very exciting to know na ang dami nating Filipino-Chinese personalities before na who played a big role in our Filipino-Chinese history.
It's such a great experience. Parang dito talaga natin matututunan yung fun in learning.
The culture, tradition, and heritage of the Chinese Filipinos are clearly depicted in this place. But above all, it represents the stronger bond between two nations. Visit them at 32 Anda Street, corner Cabildo Street, Intramuros, 1002 Manila, Philippines. For inquiries, you may email via info@bahaychinoy.org.
Intramuros is very important to us because of the lessons in heritage and history. Siguro, in one line no, ng objective ng Bahay Chinoy, establish our rightful place in the Philippine sun. Bukas ito sa public noong 1999, no? Inilalarawan nito ang bahagi at ang impact ng mga Chinese Filipinos in all aspects of Philippine life. I wish that the Bahay Chinoy can be recognized in the whole Intramuros and the whole Philippine society. I wish all the visitors, the audience, regardless of race, regardless of origin, regardless of your religion, can be recognized as part of this nation and as part of this nation building and the history of the Philippines. Ako po si Teresita Angsi, founding president ng Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran at ngayon ay executive trustee ng Kaisa Heritage Foundation na nagmamanage sa Bahay Chinoy, Museum of the Chinese in Philippine Life.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to be starting very soon.
Did EG disappear?
Yung internet niya hindi stable. Akin yun, hindi. Yun, medyo nagna-nervous na ako sa internet.
Okay lang yan. I'm sure it will be okay. Okay.
Jen, I think,
Yeah, we can start.
Char, what do you think?
Yes, yes.
All right. So a very pleasant good evening to everyone. And thank you for spending this rainy Friday. At least here in Manila, it's rainy. So thank you for spending your Friday evening here with us. And we will be listening to our guest speaker and distinguished professor on a very interesting and highly relevant topic that has become even more prominent in recent years. My name is Jennifer Kalubadi. I'm your host this evening, and tonight we're going to be learning more about celebrating diversity, race, ethnicity, gender, and identity. Our webinar is co-organized by Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran, Kaisa Heritage Foundation, Bahay Chinoy Museum, and the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. These are organizations that have been in the forefront of promoting both political and cultural discussions to deepen awareness and understanding of current events towards integration and peace. As this is a very interesting topic that often sparks equally diverse reactions, we have one request for our audience tonight. It is that we encourage open dialogue that is both candid and respectful so that this can truly be a positive learning opportunity for all of us. We will have an open forum after the speakers where we will cover questions from all of you. So we encourage you to post your questions in the chat. And for those who are shy, you may also send your questions or comments directly to Shar Kua. So just note her and then you can send your questions directly to her. So let's begin, shall we? To start off the program, allow me to call on the president of Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran, Mr. Michael Guzman, for our opening remarks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, Kaisa family, friends, partners, board, and trustees, PAX President Romel Malawi, and PAX members. Thank you. Thank you for joining tonight's webinar with Professor Richard Chu, hosted by Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran and the Philippine Association of Chinese Studies. 感谢大家出席今天晚上菲律宾华裔青年联合会和菲律宾中华研究协会一起举办的讲座。我们非常荣幸能邀请到吴兴奇教授来为大家讲解。Throughout the years, Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran and the Philippine Association of Chinese Studies have partnered together and hosted several conferences, talks, and events. Our close ties with each other also came from our founding president, Ms. Teresita Angsi, being also one of the past president of PAX. The last project that the two organizations work on together is the Chinoy Conference, which was way back January 2020, before the pandemic. Professor Richard Chu also was a co-convener of that Chinoy Conference. Professor Richard Chu has been a long-time friend and an active supporter of Kaisa and PAX. His research interest centers on the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines, focusing on nationalism, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. During the past year, we have been seeing an increase in anti-Asian sentiment in the United States. And here in the Philippines, anti-Chinese sentiment has also increased. one of the factors of the anti-Chinese sentiment in the US is because of the first competition between China and America for the economic supremacy. While the Chinese anti-Chinese sentiment in the Philippines is largely due to the dispute between China and Philippines over the islands in the West Philippine Sea. Tonight, Professor Richard Chu will share to us about his observations on anti-Asian racism and xenophobia in the United States and other related topics. These topics are very relevant and interesting for the Chinoy community because such xenophobia is now being directed at any that is Chinese, including us, Filipinos of Chinese descent. Tonight, we have also invited Assistant Professor Frances Antoinette Cruz of the College of Arts and Letters in the University of Philippines as our panelist for tonight's webinar. Before we formally introduce our speakers for tonight's webinar, let us welcome Jennifer Kalumbati to give us some backgrounds about PAX and Kaisa para sa Kaulalan and its recent activities. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the opening remarks that has set the tone for our talk tonight. If I may just request EG to set up the presentation so that I can also give a backgrounder for our two organizations. We're starting with Kaisa. Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran began in 1987 as a non-government organization aimed at promoting the integration of the Chinese Filipino into the mainstream of Philippine society. Kaisa helps bring Chinese Filipinos into meaningful participation in national concerns. It also hopes to enhance the Filipinos' understanding and awareness of the ethnic Chinese minority. Through the years, Kaisa continues to receive support from all sectors of Filipino and Chinese. Kaisa Heritage Center received positive response from a diverse cross-section of personalities and organizations, including the alumni and the family associations in the Chinoy community. While Kaisa's work is far from over, members are secure in the knowledge that for better or for worse, Kaisa's presence has made a difference and will continue to do so. Through its social, civic, and development projects like Alay Medicina, Alay Dunong, Alay Puso, skills and entrepreneurship training to name some, Kaisa reaches out to the grassroots. Nation building and poverty alleviation are the keywords of the decade, and integration is to be achieved through helping the country. Through its research and publications, Kaisa acts as a bridge for information dissemination. This includes Tulay, a fortnightly Chinese-Filipino digest in English and Filipino. For readers of Chinese, Kaisa offers the weekly supplement Yonghap, published in the World News, a Chinese language daily. Through its cultural productions, Kaisa marks the Chinoy's imprint on the tapestry of Philippine culture. Kaisa has also hosted national and international conventions in the past decades. Last but not the least, Bahay Chinoy, a museum of the Chinese in Philippine life. It takes you through the saga of the Chinese Filipinos as their identities in these islands transform and evolve from merchant sailors to immigrant laborers to mestizos to ilustrados to revolutionists and to Chinoys continuing to help build this nation. To know more, we'll send you some information, but the PowerPoint being shown share the highlights of Kaisa activities in 2020 to extend support and assistance to our fellow brothers and sisters who have been affected by various calamities, such as the Taal volcano eruption, floods, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, among others. So to know more about Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran, please like us on our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter and Instagram as shown in your screen. The Philippine Association for Chinese Studies, or PACS for short, is the co-organizer for tonight, and it is a non-partisan and non-profit professional association of diverse scholars and enthusiasts that seeks to deepen knowledge of China and the Chinese among Filipinos in order to promote mutual understanding and cooperation between the Philippines and China. Thank you to Kaisa para sa Kaunlaran, Kaisa Heritage Foundation, Bahay Chinoy, and PACS for your efforts in organizing our talk tonight. And now, to introduce tonight's keynote speaker and our reactor speaker, it is my honor to call on the founding president of Kaisa and past president of PACS, the very humble and hardworking Ms. Teresita Angsi.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. First, Richard Chu. I've known Richard since his college days at Ateneo Manila because of his interest in pursuing research on history of the Chinese in the Philippines. Two of the foremost scholars on Chinoy studies, Professor Chin Si and Professor Antonio Tan, passed on one after another at that time, and I was comforted that there are people like Richard, young successors, to continue the study on the Chinese in the Philippines. Richard got his MA in East Asian Studies from Stanford and his PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he has been teaching since 2004 and where he was recently promoted to full professor. Congratulations, Richard. It was not an easy decision to pursue academic pursuits because of the predominantly merchant culture of the Chinoy that frowns upon careers other than business, especially for males. He got very little support before he left for the United States, but he struggled and his persistence paid off. He will elaborate on this personal background in his talk later. He's key convener of the two Chinoy conferences in 2017 and 2020 held in Manila and authored two valuable works on Chinese mestizos and 19th century Chinese merchants, aside from the book that he will talk about tonight. Our discussant, an equally accomplished academic, Frances Antoinette Cruz, or Frankie. She's among the rare Philippine scholars who pursued studies in Germany. Frankie got her MA in International Studies from UP and German Studies from the University of Bielefeld, Germany. Now she is assistant professor at the Department of European Languages and co-convener of the Decolonial Studies program, both at UP Diliman. This while pursuing a double doctorate in literature and linguistics at the University of Antwerp and politics at the University of Ghent, both in Germany. Imagine, literature, linguistics, and politics, double PhD. She's doing pioneering work using technology, specifically digital text analysis method for her research on decolonial approaches in language studies. Her current project involves tracing the representation of minorities in the Philippines in historical newspapers and contemporary print and social media using digital tools. Her latest publication, International Studies in the Philippines, Mapping New Frontiers in Theory and Practice, is co-edited with Nasef Manabilang Adirong and was published by Routledge in April 2020. So that's our introduction of our two very accomplished speakers tonight. Back to you, Jennifer.
So now may we call on our keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Richard Chu.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm just going to turn on my PowerPoint presentation before I begin. I hope that everyone can see the slide. Can everyone see it? Okay. Good evening, everyone, or good morning or afternoon, as the case may be. I would like to thank the members, staff, and officers of Kaisa para sa Kaundaran, Kaisa Heritage Center, Bahay Chinoy, and the Filipino Association for Chinese Studies for inviting me to come to speak to you tonight. I would also like to thank Professor Francis Cruz for agreeing to be the discussant. Finally, I would like to thank everyone present here for taking time to listen and to participate in the discussion of tonight's theme, which is celebrating diversity, especially in terms of racial, ethnic, gender, and sexual diversity. Now, to start off, I'd like to share a little background about myself. Let's see. I was born to a family of 7 children, and I am the only son. And as many of you know, having a son is, or at least was, a big deal in Chinoy families. I was educated in Jesuit schools, first at Xavier School, then at the Ateneo de Manila University. After graduating from college, I taught at the Sacred Heart School for Boys in Cebu for a year as a Jesuit volunteer, then went to Xiamen University as an exchange student, then returned to the Philippines, taught and worked at Ateneo, then proceeded to do my MA and PhD in California. In 2004, I started my job at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, as Teresita Angsi had mentioned. I give you this short biographical background in order to contextualize the work that I do. Being part of a minority group in the Philippines, as well as part of a sexual minority, has largely led me to do the work that I do today, which is, as an academic, to understand historical reasons for racial, ethnic, gender, or sexual discrimination, and to find ways to break down the divisions caused by such discrimination by promoting and celebrating diversity, inclusion, and equity. And so tonight, my presentation will be divided into 3 parts. First, I will be talking about the anti-Asian racism here in the United States. Second, I will present the findings of a recent journal article that I wrote. And third, I will talk about the anthology of LGBTIA+ studies in the Philippines that I co-edited with Dr. Mark Glacius and which was just published by Bibal Foundation. So first, anti-Asian racism in the US. For the past year or so, especially during the pandemic and the lockdown here in the United States, a spate of anti-Asian racism made the news. One of these attacks involved a Filipino woman in New York, as can be seen in this clip.
The Asian American woman who survived an assault in broad daylight while on her way to church. The attack now being prosecuted as a hate crime with that anti-Asian hate crime bill ready for President Biden's signature. She spoke with Juju Chang about how she is healing and shared a message for the attacker. Good to see you, Juju. Good morning.
Good morning to you, Robin. You know, Vilma Carey refuses to let victimhood define her. And this all happened during a year when hate crimes overall decreased, but they've more than doubled against Asian Americans after being blamed unfairly for the pandemic. Vilma has gotten stronger as she heals both physically and emotionally. And now she is stepping out of the shadows to use her voice to fight hate.
This morning, the woman who survived this horrifying attack that enraged the nation, speaking out for the first time.
There are so many victims that have not been heard from their stories, and maybe it could be a voice.
The beating of 65-year-old Vilma Carey caught on surveillance video, now a symbol of anti-Asian hate. The Filipino American was strolling to church Easter week when out of nowhere, a man kicks Vilma, knocking her down. stomping on her face repeatedly. And then the seemingly callous inaction of bystanders who watch it all unfold and close the door.
I saw a text from my mom that said, call me.
So these and other incidents have occurred in the past year, and even here in Amherst, where I teach, which is supposed to be a liberal or progressive town, such incidents do occur, as seen in this video that I will be showing you.
The Asian American woman.
Super smart.
Yeah.
I wasn't lying.
You should really take this show on the road.
I'm Puerto Rican. Is that wrong?
This occurred in a bus, inside the bus here in Amherst. It was captured on the phone of a person in the bus.
Super smart.
Yeah.
I wasn't lying.
You should really take this show on the road.
I'm Puerto Rican. Is that wrong?
That's right.
I love Puerto Rican.
That's right. What about this guy?
We don't love you.
I love Korean.
Do they need to
I love
speak
every
English?
country. But when they come to America, it would be nice if they spoke English.
Too bad for
That's
you.
not racist.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
The United States doesn't have an official language, jackass.
I never said it did.
Well, then they don't have to speak it for you because they're not talking to you.
I'm so glad.
Exactly.
Yeah,
You should have just mind your own
otherwise
business.
Nobody would be standing up to your racist ass.
Really?
Yeah.
That's considered
Really?
racism?
Yes,
I
it
never-
is.
Okay.
And you should learn the definition of it and not to show your ass in public again.
So you get to harass me.
Ain't nobody's harassing
The
you.
freedom of
You're
speech.
talking back to me, silly.
Okay.
You
Right.
stop talking, and so
I
will
was
I.
talking to them.
I don't
and
care
all
if
of a
they weren't
sudden,
talking to you.
You chimed in.
That's right.
You won't
We did.
See
He
how it
did what
works?
you did.
If
He
you
did
wanna
what
chime
you
in
did.
on somebody else's conversation, then you have to expect it.
All right.
Yeah.
So there you go. This is the
Yeah.
kind of world that you want. Aren't you happy now? Oh, it's good. I'm happy. I'm fine. I'm just not willing to let this racist idiot get away with his sort of stupid narrative.
Right.
Oh,
Good
I'm not a
man.
racist.
Good man. Good man.
Listen to these people.
So to give you that context, this woman heard two Chinese students in the bus speaking in Chinese, and then that's when she started talking to them, harassing them, saying that they should be speaking in English. And these two other passengers in the bus started then to engage her in calling her out on her behavior for being racist. So as you most know, these incidents were stoked or inflamed by the anti-Chinese rhetoric of politicians or pundits blaming the origin and spread of the COVID-19 virus on China. For those of you in the Philippines, you may be appalled by the reports or images that you see on social media. But such anti-Asian rhetoric or violence is not new in this country. Ever since the founding of the US, the country has been built upon the racist ideology of white supremacy. That is, in the belief that the white race is superior to non-white races, and that it was destined to rule over the world. This was emblematized by the belief in manifest destiny, that is, of the white man's burden, as well as responsibility to take over the lands of other people and to subjugate them. This we see in its history of taking over the Native Americans' lands, the rise of slavery, the colonization of overseas territories such as Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and its continuing racist policies domestically and abroad. In relation to specifically Asians and Asian Americans, the country has enacted laws or implemented policies discriminating against Asians solely due to their skin color. And here are some of the examples that I list on the screen that discriminated against the Asians or Asian Americans throughout American history. This white supremacist ideology is also played out in the construction of Asians or Asian Americans as the quote unquote model minority, which results in tensions between Asians and other people of color. And to some, The United States is an empire built on the racist ideology or white supremacy and on the backs of people of color. From the time of the ethnic genocide involving Native Americans, slavery, colonization, World War II, and Cold War incursions into other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, to its neoliberal economic policies that continue to decimate the economies of the global South and force people to migrate. For my part, I participate in the efforts to dismantle racism by teaching about its history, whether within the context of the history of the Filipinos under American colonial rule, of the Asian Americans in the United States, and of the different Chinese diasporic communities in the world, especially that of the Philippines. I also engage in outreach work to underserved Asian American communities here in Western Massachusetts through my course and also through oral history projects. And lastly, I'm also involved in my university in anti-racism committees. And in terms of my research, I continue to do research and publish on this topic. So this leads me to the next segment of my presentation, which is to present to you some of the highlights of an article that I just published, and that deals with racial and ethnic identities in the Philippines. This article is entitled "From Sangley to Chinaman, Chinese Mestizo to Chinoy: Unpacking Chinese Identities in the Philippines at the Turn of the 20th Century." So this was published in the journal Asian Ethnicity. This research is part of my overall research agenda that tries to explain the historical reasons for racial discrimination against the Chinese in the Philippines. It builds on my past publications, including my first book manuscript, Chinese and Chinese Mestizos of Manila, Chinese Merchants of Binondo, and More Chinoy Than We Admit. I was inspired to write this piece due to the increasing racial tension between the Chinese and the Filipinos. As many of you here may have observed or there in the Philippines, this tension is connected to the rise of China as a global power and its aggressive efforts to spread its influence, whether through economic ties or military expansion. It is a well-known fact that the Philippines is in dispute with China over the ownership of a group of islands in the South China or West Philippine Sea, that over the years, President Duterte's government has been quote unquote friendly to China and wooing its government to invest there. Consequently, there has been an increase in the presence of Chinese companies in the country, with a concomitant rise in Chinese nationals working there. And as a result of these developments, the Chinese in the Philippines, particularly or including the Chinese Filipinos or Chinoys, have been targeted for discrimination. Writers like Solita Monsod and F. Shonin Jose conflate them with the Chinese nationals, putting into question their loyalty for the Philippines, and see all Chinese as homogeneous. One example of this view can be seen in this exchange back in 2017 in the Senate between Senator Dick Gordon and Bureau of Customs Commissioner Neil Estrella in regards to a bust of Shabu worth more than 6.4 billion pesos and coming from China. At some point in the hearing, Senator Dick Gordon asked Neil Estrella, "Chinese ka, di ba? Aren't you Chinese?" Gordon was asking Estrella because he saw Estrella using an interpreter to talk to Richard Tan, the Chinese national whose company received the Shabu equipment from China. The following clip shows the rest of the exchange.
Substance is really methamphetamine or Shabu, Your Honor. You're half Chinese, aren't you? You're half Chinese, aren't you? Not half, Your Honor, but my mother's name is Lim. Lim, you speak Chinese, right? No, Your Honor. You don't? I don't, Your Honor. Are you sure? Yes, Your Honor. We'll find out about that later. Yes, Your Honor. You can understand Chinese? No, Your Honor. Just some few words and few lines, Your Honor. All right. Ano, okay o Mandarin? I studied Mandarin level 1 and level 2, but I think I miserably substance is really methamphetamine. Yes, Your Honor. You can understand Chinese? No, Your Honor. Just some few words and few lines, Your Honor. All right. Ano, okay o Mandarin? I studied Mandarin level 1 and level 2, but I think I miserably forget everything, Your Honor. Or conveniently forget everything. Not miserably, conveniently. No, Your Honor. Hindi po talaga ako nakipag-usap ng Chinese kahit kanino, Your Honor. I just tried to memorize some words. All right. When Magsuchi arrived, is it not true that substance is really methamphetamine?
So that's the transcript of the exchange between the senator and the Bureau of Customs Commissioner. This conflating of Chinese identities is not something new, since the Chinese have been coming to the Philippines for centuries. In this essay that was recently published, I searched for the historical antecedents of this occurrence in which new Chinese immigrants, whom we today call Xinqiao, were lumped together with those who have planted roots in Philippine society. This research, so the aim of this article is to demonstrate how terms pertaining to the Chinese in the Philippines over time have been used, invented, negotiated by different groups, that is, both the Chinese and the Chinese themselves. This research took me back to the latter part of the 19th and earlier part of the 20th centuries, when there was an increase in the number of Chinese, many of whom were laborers coming to the country. It was also the time when Filipino revolutionaries fought against the Spaniards and the Americans for independence, which ended in the United States taking over the Philippines in 1898. In the ensuing years after this, there was a debate on whether to allow Chinese laborers to continue coming to the Philippines or to extend the Chinese Exclusion Act in the country. These debates surrounding the, quote, Chinaman question are found in some textual documents. I scoured through some of them to see how both non-Chinese and Chinese were describing the Chinese in the Philippines at that time. For instance, I found this book written by the Spanish writer Rafael Comengue, and I noted that he not only differentiated among the Chinese in the Philippines, but he also noted that the Chinese themselves were differentiating themselves. So he wrote, "It is good to distinguish the Asiaticos. Not all are the same, although they seem so from the external aspect. Some are Chinos, and others are Macaos, and neither Macao wants to be Chino, nor Chino Macao." And then he goes further to explain his statement, saying that those from Macau are very uncomfortable if they are called Chinos, and they answer with some haughtiness that they are Macanistas, free men, even similar to the Spanish, friends of women, of games and of wine, rude as Persians and prodigals as the sons of usurers, while the Chinos are poor, work in miserable conditions, and work to save, nothing more. Another example is found in the bilingual newspaper, El Renacimiento, in which the Tagalog version carried a number of articles that talked about the political issue surrounding the, quote, Chinaman question. That is, whether to exclude them or not. One article mentioned the meeting. This is the newspaper article that I used, in this paper. You can see here on the left-hand side, it's a front page article with the headline, "Ang meeting sa Teatro Nacional, mga talumpati, ayaw kami sa insik." No? And the date was February 3, 1903. This article mentioned the meeting among Filipino unions belonging to the Unión Obrera Democrática, the first labor federation in the country. In this meeting held on February 3, 1903, noted labor union leaders spoke out against the immigration of the INSIC. Among those who spoke were Lope K. Santos, Pascual Poblete, Severino Reyes, Esteban Reyes, and Manuel Artigas. The article described the meeting as well. The article described the meeting as well attended, with, quote, thunderous applauses and boisterous cheers, punctuating the passionate speeches given in support of the move by the United States Congress to prohibit Chinese immigration to the Philippines. The article also mentioned that Santos talked about sending a telegram to the United States stating that, quote, ang INSIC ay walang nasabing napakinabang ang Pilipinas mula pa ng tulutan ng pamunuang Kastila ang dito'y pagpasok nila. So the telegram stated that the INSIC did not bring any benefit to the Philippines ever since the Spaniards allowed them entry. At the end of his speech, the crowd shouted, "Isigaw natin, ayaw tayo sa INSIC. Ayaw kami sa INSIC," which means, let's shout that we do not want the INSIC. We don't want the INSIC. The speakers pointed out that other Filipinos and Americans who supported Chinese immigration did not understand the implication and consequences of allowing them in, especially on how this would impact Filipino laborers. Furthermore, according to the article, two labor leaders excoriated one group of Filipinos who supported the Chinese. And this is Filipino women. Modesto Santiago spoke out against the bad habit of these women accepting those not of their blood, and that the coming of the INSIC was one of the biggest things that should be remembered and feared, as their coming will cause the Filipinos knowing less and less of their identity in the future. Another speaker, Dominador Gomez, pointed out that the behavior of Filipino women vis-a-vis the Chinese was an important issue that the Federation faced. For these Filipino women continued to patronize goods from Chinese stores. He said, "If language as a weapon is what we men are using to oppose the coming of the INSIC, for you women, it is to withhold your love. The enthusiasm of your spirit hopefully is not just momentary, and that the moment you step out of this theater, you do not proceed to the store of the INSIC, because what you buy there is not life-giving food, but poison." Thus, from these examples, you can see how the terms used to refer to the Chinese were constructed differently by different people. For example, among the Chinese themselves, they were distinguishing each other, a practice that is similar to what Chinoys are doing when some of them, for example, call the Xinqiao Taidyoka or CNN, which means Jianangnang. In the case of Filipinos, referring to the Chinese, the newspaper article I presented here demonstrates that, one, Filipinos conflate the Chinese laborers and those who had been staying in the Philippines for a long time. And secondly, that Filipino men and women looked at the Chinese differently. From this research, I conclude that this practice of inventing epithets for the Chinese is nothing new, and that there are historical continuities. However, we need to pay attention to the differing conditions or historical reasons for the continued construction and negotiation of the meanings of being Chinese. Furthermore, we need to carefully examine what race and racism mean within the Philippine context. Finally, Let me talk about one of my latest projects that also deal with diversity, but in the realm of sexual identities. Recently, I co-edited an anthology of LGBTIA plus studies in the Philippines together with Mark Blasius of the City University of New York. The aim of this anthology is to examine the different gender and sexual identities in the Philippines and what these mean within the local context. My co-editor and I wanted to see what terms like bakla or tomboy mean when used in the Philippines and how these terms differ from the meanings of sexual and gender identities in Western countries or in the United States. We therefore set out to look for articles that had been published on the topic and also commissioned new ones, and made an effort to include works of Filipino or Philippine-based scholars such as J. Neil Garcia, Roland Tolentino, Michael Tan, Jennifer Joseph, and Ronald Baitan. In this anthology, I also published my essay called Growing Up Male, Catholic, Chinese, and the Son My Mother Wanted Me to Be. In this essay, I describe my life experiences as ethnically Chinese, Filipino, and as a gay person. In writing about my story, I'm hoping that its publication would help stimulate discussion among the Chinoys about sexual diversity within their community. I started being aware that I was gay when I was 12 years old, and throughout my teenage years, I tried to deal with or understand it by seeking counseling while in college. For me, the concern or anxiety of being gay within our society came from these two sources. First, family pressure coming from traditional Confucian mores, and secondly, Catholic teachings regarding homosexuality. Being the only son, I was pressured to pass on the family name by having a heterosexual marriage and a heteronormative family. However, the fact that my father died early when I was only 12 years old, and having a mother who was very understanding helped ease the pressure. For had my father been alive, I would have had a harder time living out my sexual identity. But who knows? Fathers are not necessarily less accepting of their gay children. As for my mother, I must say that she truly tried to understand and accept me, and so I was really fortunate to have her as my mother. As for my Catholic faith, I was able to reconcile my faith with my sexuality because my Jesuit education um, in Xavier School and at Ateneo taught me that one has to be always true to oneself. Secondly, um, it taught me that God accepts and loves me for who I am, and that He supports me having a loving relationship with another man. I know that this is different from current Catholic teaching, which, while claiming to love homosexual individuals, discourages them from living out their sexuality. I hope that someday sexual diversity in the Philippines will be more accepted so that people can live more openly and be who they want to be without fear of reprisals or ostracization. So that ends my presentation. And as a plug, if you want to buy the anthology, if you're in the Philippines, you just go to the Vibal Shop website, and they're giving a 20% discount from July 5th to August 31. And just make sure that you type in the code RT2, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Richard Chu, for your comprehensive presentation on the history of discrimination as it applies to ethnicity, race, gender, that we have experienced also here in the Philippines, and for sharing your personal experiences as well. With that comprehensive sharing, I'm very excited to give the floor to our reactor. May I now invite Miss Frances Antoinette Cruz to take the floor.
Hi everyone. Good evening to all of you. I think it's evening in the Philippines. I'm not sure how it is. Are you in California or in Massachusetts, Richard? Is it morning over there?
It's 8:50 in the morning.
Okay, good morning. I'm here in Belgium, so it's afternoon for us. I'd like to emphasize 2 points in my reaction to this wonderful, comprehensive presentation. And the 2 points will be different contexts and contours of intersectionality, which I think we'll also talk about later in the open forum, and the evolving nature of terms and concepts, which is kind of related to the research I'm doing now as well with Rocio Ortuño, my advisor. So globalization and the internet have brought issues such as Black Lives Matter and Me Too across the world. They've become a global phenomenon. There are publics from the United States to Asia talking about these issues, and I generally think that's quite a good thing, that these issues that were perhaps ignored in a past time and maybe in the 20th century are now being openly talked about and discussed, and it's become very personal. At the same time, we are all active consumers, I think, of very largely American-centric discourses, and that's probably because of English, the English language being used in the Philippines as opposed to maybe Spanish or French or German or other Asian languages even in the Philippines, or the availability of such discourses to the public. And it is all too easy to forget other contexts, that we live in a world where the United States may be a hegemon, but there are other contexts, other countries, other concepts and discourses. And this is also why English borrows many words from other languages to enrich the vocabulary and conceptual reach of the English language. So you think about words like Weltanschauung, for example, which was appropriated from German into sociology because there was no English concept to explain what this was. It's also easy to forget, I think, that while we're all, I think many of us here are young and like throwing around words like ethnocentrism, xenophobia, racism, prejudice, and these words do not mean the same thing. So I think it's very important when we talk about ethnocentrism, xenophobia, racism, and prejudice, we have to understand that these words have nuances and that these nuances are very important, and we have to be careful about when we use them. So when racism is discussed, a lot of what we are talking about is structural racism and not everyday prejudice, right? So these may be two different things. Yeah, I don't want to have a sociological discussion right now. So that's something we have to think about. But when we think of intersectionality, it is not just the privileging of one particular identity over the other parts of our identity. Nor do I personally understand intersectionality as a way of essentializing personal identities. Rather, the way I understand it is understood as a means of solidarity to overcome oppressive forces and practices in society and to effect positive change, let's say. This is at least my understanding of the role of identity in the political and to a certain degree in the social sphere. This means as well, so when we think about different contexts, that this has different contours in the US than it does in Asia, despite there being prejudice, xenophobia, ethnocentrism, and also racism in both of these contexts. First, it is the term, let's say, Chinese American or Asian American, Chinese American has lumped together with this larger umbrella category of the Asian American. So it is surprising for me, for example, because I haven't grown up in the United States and I've never lived there. And for those as well who were not raised in North America to encounter this way of thinking, as Asia is a diverse continent. You know, Asia includes India, China, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand, etc. And we do not really actually share a language or a religion. And the term Asian plus nationality is not frequently used in migrant groups in continental Europe, for example. So I'm not hearing Asian Belgian or Asian German, despite histories of colonialism. In the US in particular, Asians are not only subject to further, so apart from the ethnic dimension, they're also subject to generational and class differences. They are thought of as a model minority, which is also maybe a kind of prejudice, you know, even though it's positive. And they are considered as part of people of color. So when we think about this context, it's kind of difficult to appropriate these terms in the Philippine context, such as POC, because I guess we're all POC, in the Philippines. However, there are other intersectional configurations we have to discuss in the Philippines, such as economic differences, which are still very important in the Philippines, and the weight of colonial history. That's why I'm in the decolonizing program, and its other attendant otherings and geopolitics as well. So this is something that we have to think about when we discuss racism, ethnocentrism, xenophobia in different contexts. Now, the second thing I'd like to discuss is the evolving nature of terms and concepts. So I'm working on a project that I discussed a little bit earlier with my advisor, Rocio, and this has to do with the digital humanities. So we are digitizing an archive of multilingual newspapers in the Philippines in Spanish and English and in Tagalog. There are other languages, of course, but it'll take a while before they are all digitized because they're all in the archives somewhere in UP Diliman collecting dust. And before a fire comes, so hopefully not, we are trying to digitize them and save them on the internet. And from these newspapers that we're digitizing, we're trying to extract information about how minorities were talked about from the end of the Spanish era to the 1960s, when we gained independence and we already had our own government, etc. And it's very interesting to look at how minorities, so I'm looking at Muslims, my advisor is looking at Chinese in the Philippines, were discussed per language and per time period. So what are the discontinuities and continuities about the way Chinese and Muslims were talked about in Philippine newspapers across time and across these multilingual papers? This is because the usage of terms and the things that we associate with these terms tends to change over time, even though some parts of these terms remain consistent. And this is because they change because of cultural, societal, current events, and rising political discourses, so geopolitics as well. So what is the role of perceived role of Muslims in geopolitics? And we saw this in the rise of 2001, so 9/11, and how we talked about Muslims may or may not have changed since the idea of a terrorist came into our vocabulary. And the same is true for China with the pandemic and the rising growing power of China, how we look at Chinese and society. So we cannot understand forms of ethnocentrism and othering in a vacuum, as they tend to have some different nuances over time, as Professor True has already mentioned. And this is also true, I'd like to say, for the even more complex picture of sexuality and gender. And it's great that that was brought up, because we are all then judged and treated in society according to a combination of these factors, and they tend to determine how much power we have and feel within a particular society, and also how much power we can exert over other people, how much power they feel in relation to us. So if someone feels less powerful in relation to us, how would that affect their perception of myself? And this is very rapidly evolving. So in relation to what I said about the evolution of terms, before there was like a term, one term, homosexual, and now there are words like non-binary, bisexual, pansexual, demisexual, and the list is growing. And it's even harder for those who come from more traditional, let's say, persuasions or more traditional background to keep up with this challenging vocabulary, and also the changing of, let's say, the European languages, which are trying to become a little bit less gendered, because like Spanish genders, items. So my own hope, for example, with regard to these things, because there's a lot of, let's say, pre-colonial texts that are more gender fluid, for example, or that maybe even more open to the idea of the other, so maybe how were Muslims and Chinese thought of before colonialism? That's particularly interesting, because maybe we had a different relationship to these groups at that time, or there was no clear distinction between them and the rest of society in what would later on be called the Philippines. So my hope is that we do not always get influenced by discourses that come from powerful sources that may not reflect our own reality, and we don't get categorized or lumped into these terms. We can expand our own horizons to other contexts, cultures, languages, and ways of being. Yeah, that's all. And I look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Frankie. So thank you for the quite comprehensive insight on the sharing of Professor Richard Chu and bringing to light additional layers of this issue that are really relevant and part of the discussion on this topic. After hearing our speakers, I'm sure we have an exciting and enlightening open forum ahead of us. So let's welcome our moderator, PAC's Corporate Secretary and Lecturer at the Confucius Institute at the Ateneo de Manila University, Ms. Charlene May Kua, who will now be moderating the open forum. Char, the floor is yours. Hi, Char.
Hello.
There you are.
Hello. Yeah, there. Thank you, Jen. Thank you to Professor Richard Chu and Professor Francis Cruz, our two distinguished speakers for tonight's webinar. Both presentations were very interesting, which actually prompted our audience to send in questions on our topic of celebrating diversity. I think the questions are coming from different backgrounds and profiles. I think we have people from the business sector, from the academe, or even just with the family, no? Without further ado, let's proceed with our first question for the night. I think I would like to address this question to both of the speakers, Richard and Francis. How can one be proud of one's culture and heritage without being accused of ethnocentrism, xenophobia, and or racism? Can we hear first from Richard?
Thank you. I think as long as what you celebrate is not used to otherize other people, and when you say otherize, it means to really put them in a kind of a essentializing manner where you also compare yourself with the other so-called group, so as to prove, for example, there's not only difference, but that there is a superiority, superior inferior relationship. So as long as one avoids doing that, I think then it's really healthy and even wonderful to celebrate one's own culture and heritage. Francis?
Yeah. I'd have to agree that when we talk about ethnocentrism, there is a form of hierarchy and power involved when you say I'm ethnocentric or I'm racist. That you have to notice that power does play a role in the perceptions of identities. And I think that the way you exercise that power when you express who you are will then determine whether or not it is in fact racist, ethnocentric, or prejudiced. How you treat the other, because I do think that any form of categorization does exclude something. So when you call yourself something, it means you're also not something. So if I say that you could also have many identities at the same time, because maybe they're not mutually exclusive, but a lot of identities are seen as black and white, and that's also a function of language and concept making. But it really depends what the power relationships look like and how you treat people who are considered not part of that group. And that's a way, and existing in a peaceful space where you don't have to exercise superiority, hierarchy, power dynamics, violence against the other group is a healthy way of expressing who you are in terms of your ethnic identity or in terms of any other identity as well. However, some of these things are unavoidable. That's why it's hard, you know. I studied in Germany for quite a while, and they have some problems with their national identity. They find it hard to be proud of themselves because the pride symbols of Germany are associated with Nazism or racism. So this kind of thing is very, very complex, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question here. During the Cold War, Chinese ethnicity and affinity has often been associated with communist China and suspicion from the mainstream of communist sympathy from the ethnic minority Chinese and mixed Chinese. In the 21st century, has this perception of the alien other has evolved or changed, especially now amidst of the COVID-19 pandemic or Black Lives Matter and the present Biden administration? Who would like to take this?
So I guess the question is saying whether the present situation is also leading again to a anti-Chinese xenophobia in the world, and
Yes.
how it's probably different from earlier earlier images of the Chinese as being part of communist state and so on and so forth. I think the scholars have pointed out that historically the Chinese or people in so-called Far East, including Japan, have been seen as the other, of vis-a-vis, especially Europe, Western Europe, and so it comes from a long historical tradition of the Far East, whether it's Japan or China, as being the other of Europe or of the West, and some scholars call this yellow perilism, which is a way of thinking and living that thinks that people from China, people from Japan, and these two places, and later on expanded also to the Orient or to Asia in general, are seen as dangerous, different, mysterious. So this is not surprising that as long as the United States or Europe or in general the West continue to see China and Japan or Asia in general as the other, these kinds of discrimination or xenophobia will continue. There are these continuities, and as Dr. Cruz says, while there are also discontinuities, these continuities should also be seen within the geopolitical context or the context of what's happening or going on at the time.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, we have another question here. Francis mentioned about intersectionality a while ago. So how do you think diversity can contribute to organizational effectiveness, especially during this global pandemic? Maybe we can hear from Francis.
Everything has to be related to the pandemic, right? I mean, I'm not a
Yes.
pandemic scholar, so I think this is a new and emerging issue, and the empirics will have to then come out of it. So there's a saying in academia, the owl of Minerva always comes, I forgot what it was exactly, but it's saying that you only get to know things in hindsight, so it's very hard to say at this moment. I would not experience that I am into, but I do think that it really depends on the context. I always talk about context, and I think we have to be. I'll give you an anecdote from a different thing that I'm writing on. In the US, a lot of gender rules are being imposed now in companies, so diversity training, etc. And this has not always been proven to be effective. Like after the one gender diversity training, it doesn't necessarily make people who are racist become anti-racist or anything like that. So this is a huge discussion in the US, but at the same time, US guidelines on how to be more gender fair and inclusive in the workplace may not apply in other countries. For example, in the Philippines, we have a higher gender index than the US. So why should they be telling us, how to do certain things? I do believe that if you're in an MNC in particular, it's very important to have different perspectives, of course. But I can't really speak for the other organizations, right? That's not my research field. Sorry.
It's okay, Francis. We have a live question here from Jackie Ko. It goes, how do you make Pinoys in the Philippines realize that their anti-Chinese inticacy kind of relation is no way different from the spike of anti-Asian incident sentiments in the United States? Any, Richard or Francis?
I'll take a stab on that. First of all, I think we have to sort of understand what are the race relations going within the Philippines. And through that, then we would be able to sort of understand the kind of racism that goes on in the country. I think certainly there is xenophobia happening in the Philippines, Filipinos against the Chinese and vice versa. But I'm not sure that it can be equated wholesale with the anti-Asian kind of xenophobia in the United States. I mean, on a general scale, you can say that this is xenophobia, this is racial discrimination. But in terms of why it happens and how it happens, I think these are two different things. So I would say in answer to that question, I think we need to really talk about race and racism in the Philippines, but be also careful not to just simply use the kind of racial ideology and dynamics in the US as a basis for understanding or resolving these issues.
Do you want to add anything, Francis?
I'd have to agree that it is in a completely different context, which is why intersectionality and context are important, as I've been trying to explain in the discussion. In the Philippines, for example, and also the word, Pinoy ka kasi, Inche ka kasi, etc. That kind of thing. I mean, in what context is it used? Is it meant in a joking way? Because these kinds of stereotypes, even though they're not accepted in humor these days because of being politically correct, sometimes it's an ignorant thing that people just say in jest or in ignorance, but sometimes there's a deeper, more menacing meaning, and I think it's up to our own interpersonal skills to determine when and how that kind of thing was said. Like if someone told me, Pinay ka kasi, it really depends on what follows before, or how friendly I am with that person in order for me on a personal level to understand whether or not that's actually racist or in what sense it was meant. So we need context here, the larger context of the statement, and also the context, the social context and cultural context in which it happens. Another thing in the Philippines is, remember, power is one of the most important defining traits of this. So if one of the actors in this conversation is perceived to have more economic power, for example, than the other, or more positional power in terms of an organization, so if it's your boss being discriminatory towards you, that's a problem. But if you're two people slugging it out in a bar, then that there is no power dynamic there except for maybe your fists. So it is not equivalent for me, at least, because there is so much context and so much personal information that has to be understood with the use of this term that one cannot really draw parallels. And it's also not a scholarly way of drawing a nuance here, because it's not like Facebook where you can just argue, kasi ganito. This is not a, scholarly work is not this kind of discourse. It's a discourse of nuance. It's not like, kasi ganyan ka rin eh. We can't use this in a scholarly context.
Thanks for that, Francis. Let's move on to gender inclusivity. We have a question here that goes, would you say that liberalism is the solution to the country's need for gender inclusivity? Question is raised by Serena Alonso. Yes?
I'm not so sure about what liberalism here means. Whether it's like being more open or progressive, liberal in terms of views, or whether it's connected to neoliberalism as an ideology or liberalism as an ideology. But I take it to mean more of like being liberal, being more open-minded, progressive, giving sort of priority to individual choice or preference. I think there has to be kind of a balance, and I think there has to be some kind of a discussion, because I think in Philippine society, it has been described as being where the individual is not given priority, but that the individual is defined vis-a-vis the family, the community, the society, or the nation in which the individual lives. And so that individual rights don't take precedence over societal rights. And so therefore that could mean that you have to subsume your own preferences or choices or your own freedom and happiness in order to for the good of the society. And I think there has to be some change in that. I mean, and here on the other extreme, again, I'm using extreme examples in the US where people celebrate individuality. You have to be who you are, be free to be who you are, to the extent that some people think and practice non-social responsibility. So I think, personally, I think there has to be a balance between knowing when individual preferences or rights take precedence over the good of the society, so to speak. Frances, maybe you have another.
I'll use a decolonial answer. I'll answer the question with another question. And the question is, why must we always rely on Western frameworks as providing the answer to all of our problems? Why should liberalism be the only answer to a question that we may answer with our own traditional ideas and flexibility and fluidity and gender? And if you look at pre-colonial sources, this is the case. Before colonizers came, we had a very interesting, let's say, colorful way of looking at gender. Filipino language, Tagalog, and all the other Austronesian languages that are in this country are all genderless. We don't distinguish. There's only one word for he, she, it's siya, right? So I don't know why we have to rely on something, or maybe we can make it our own. That's another argument from other scholars, that we can kind of localize this idea of liberalism, but at the same time, it needs to be defined. How do you express liberalism? Are there other alternatives? Are there ways we can kind of localize it? But to say, okay, let's get the liberalism that I'm seeing on Tumblr, on Twitter, on Huffington Post, and just apply it here. Let me just say that we've taken many political policies from the West. Not all of them have worked out very well, so let's be careful.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is something we can address, but there's a comment. There's a request to comment on Buddhist and Islamic view on homosexuality. Can we address this one, or?
I have a recommended source if you want to look at. Well, okay. I'm not going to say it, maybe because it might be a sensitive topic and I don't want to put a friend of mine on the spot, but maybe you can message me and I can send you some readings on Islam and homosexuality, because there are debates about it in the academe. So I'm not going to, and I'm not also Islamic scholar per se. So if you would like to know these sources, you can message me.
Okay, that's good. We'll share that to the person who asked. We have a question here addressed to Richard. Richard, what can you say to a Chinay who's secretly gay in the Philippines? This question is quite interesting, yeah.
I think it's great that one recognizes first and accepts one's own sexuality, and then find support from other people. Sort of, look at your own situation. To what extent do you want to live out openly as a gay person? Um, so yun, I think the most important thing, at least, is to learn acceptance and to love oneself, and that also is helped. That I learned to love myself because I have other people who are important to my life who love me for who I am. So I think that support from loving friends and family members is important. And then what you do vis-a-vis society, your work, your school, or that really depends also on your situation. To what extent you think you would be happy, um, to what extent you want to let that identity be known to other people.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing that. We have another question here. Is racism inherent or learned, or is it considered a survival instinct to align yourself to people of your own race and push person who are different?
Can you repeat the? I didn't hear the first
Okay,
few.
sorry. Is racism inherent or learned, or it is considered a survival instinct to align yourself to people of your own race and push persons who are different?
Frances, would you like to start?
Okay, I don't know what you mean by race, because this might be an ideology that was dismissed in the 1900s. So I think we have to be quite careful because that's why we're talking about it so much now, because it's persisted despite it being a kind of rejected ideology of racial hierarchy and the idea of race. And now there are so many mixtures of different ethnicities and peoples around the world that sometimes this doesn't even make sense. It just becomes more and more complicated. I'm not an expert at biology, but there have been some studies or psychology that when you're a child, you tend to recognize those people who look familiar or look similar to you and your parents. So that's one thing. But that doesn't mean that you should act upon this distinction. And that's where you draw the line. And let's remember that racism, well, the way I use racism, and when many people talking about racism today, I'm not sure in cultural studies, but certainly in sociology, is racism has something to do with law, systems, and power. It's not just on an individual prejudice level. So you have to understand racism as something systemic. That's why there were laws against Chinese in the Philippines and Muslims in the Philippines, battles and so on, because it was institutionalized. It wasn't on a personal level where you say, ay, ikaw, ganito ka, ganyan ka. This is not really part of that idea of racism. Racism is systemic and spread throughout societies and politics, and not at this prejudice level, which is quite common in many societies across the world. But that doesn't necessarily mean that because you were of a different race, you had to kill, hate, legislate, treat others differently. It doesn't follow, right? Logically, it doesn't follow that just because you recognize that I am this and they look different, that you have to treat people with disrespect and treat them as if they're some form of subhuman. So in the sense that we could recognize differences amongst ourselves, I think that this is quite true. But in the sense that we have to turn that into antagonism is not necessarily the way things should be.
Yeah, I'm glad I agree with Frances. I don't think racism is a born trait. I think we are born with a trait or skill to differentiate, but then when we use that to discriminate and to inflict violence upon other people because of so-called race, that I think is a learned attitude or behavior. And then I'm also glad that Frances mentioned systemic racism. Actually, that was part of my lecture, and I kind of missed that. That here in the United States, that people are pointing out that combat racism, it's not just to do it on a day-to-day individual person-to-person basis, but then to recognize that there are that there is systemic racism that need to be identified, and that through a coalition of other people of color who are disadvantaged by this systemic racism, then people are able to then challenge that. the problem with here in the United States, at least, that many people don't understand or recognize systemic racism. And so people are saying that, oh, just because I'm not racist, I have a friend who's black, or I'm married to an Asian person, so I'm not racist. But racism is not just in the form of the individual day-to-day interaction, but also is embedded in the structures, in the systems, in the policies, in the laws of the nation that continues to disadvantage particular groups of people, especially people of color.
Okay. Yeah, we're getting a lot of interesting questions. I think I'm just gonna filter maybe to just last two. The first would be Professor Chu, I'm curious to hear your insight. Do you feel like LGBTQ spaces in the Philippines offer more inclusivity and less prejudice towards LGBTQ Chinese Filipinos? Or do they instead further marginalizations?
So meaning that of whether Filipino LGBT individuals feel more sort of freedom compared to Chinese Filipino LGBT individuals. Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think I haven't really thought about that, and I don't think there is a kind of a scientific answer to that. Really depends also on the background of individuals, class. But in my essay, I say that I was able to reconcile in an easier way my Catholic faith and my sexuality because my family is Buddhist and it's primarily Buddhist. My parents were Buddhist and the children were raised Catholics, but through the schooling, not through the family. And so the concept of, let's say, sin, being homosexual and how that is a sin is not something that really it affected me, but it's not as strong as the kind of religiosity that comes from Christianity and its views on sexuality. I think it's not as strong as, let's say, in families where, and I'm referring maybe to Filipino Catholic families where that teaching, Catholic teaching, and the expectation to observe those teachings are more intense. But on the other hand, one could say that among Chinese families, there confusion sort of expectations. And this is again within the context of Chinese diasporic communities where there are merchants and also some of them are carrying sort of the more traditional Confucian values or practicing the invented Confucian values of xiao, which means filial piety. You have to really respect your ancestors, and if you're a whether man or woman, you have your place in society. You have to really fit into those gender roles. That could also be very, very oppressive, So malas mo na lang if your family is both very strongly Catholic and very strongly traditional, in terms of Confucian, following Confucian values, because those are really strong external societal sort of pressures that are imposed on individuals.
Thanks for that, Richard. So this is our last question. What is the best teaching strategy to teach this topic of celebrating diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, and identity with the younger generation? Perhaps starting from the millennials generation, Generation Z, or even the younger ones, like the current junior high school students. So what do you suggest how this topic could be, imparted to these generations?
Maybe
we can start with Francis. Yeah.
Okay, I have never taught high school or grade school. So you can take this with it. Kasi, di ba, mostly based on textbooks yung tinuturo nila at saka sa curriculum because it's very structured. So I'm not really sure. And they're now even more pressured kasi meron ng senior high school, etc. So I'm not really sure where to fit this in because it's not always part of the curriculum, which is why it's very hard for me to say, okay, do this and that. And then they say, but ma'am, walang textbook. I don't really want to interfere with this, right? But I think it starts at a young age and it starts at home as well. That you can't expect that the school does everything. You have to model behavior. So if the child hears you're using these terms with reference to it's not just Chinese, it's also Indians, right? Bombay, etc. Or Muslims. Oh, delikado yan, right? You hear these things when we talk about other people and you don't nuance them. So if the child hears that from you, how do you think the child is going to talk to people who are minorities, so it's modeling and also reflecting on your own behavior, and being kind towards each other and empathetic on that basic parenting level. And in school, you've seen many of these textbooks that have terrible, I mean, not just in the Philippines, it's in other countries as well, like Hong Kong, the Saudi Arabia, they have terrible representations of other people. They say, okay, this person looks like this. They look kind of like a terrorist or thief or pirate. And then they have a drawing that looks suspiciously like a person from ethnicity XYZ. So we have to divest things from these types of textbooks, right? We have to start producing more than one story. And I think this is from a feminist, Ngozi, who talked about the relevance of having more than one story. So it's literature as well. So if you look at literature, I speak from Moros, you see that a lot of Spanish forms of literature that have a very difficult relationship with Muslims are promoted in Philippine education, right? How about stories from Mindanao? How about stories from Chinese Filipinos, Chinoys, or even East Asia in general that are in our curriculum that talk about understanding or cultural bridges, or even as children's books. The more you introduce these to children, the more they will be open to the idea of meeting people from different backgrounds who look different, who act different, talking about difficult things. I was not raised in the Philippines. So where I came from, we had a lot of books that dealt with the position of Indians in British society. And that opened our eyes to how minority groups are treated differently, how they are bullied based on things they have no control of, whether sexuality, ethnicity, etc. And these need to be represented in our literature in order for us to build a nation, because it's a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious nation. And yet we still think of Filipinos as brown people who speak one language and have one religion, which is not the case. So I think that more of this has to seep into everything that we do. It's not just like literature has to change or cultural studies has to change. It has to come into every aspect of our lives, many aspects of our lives, or acknowledging Asian or Muslim scientists or female scientists, LGBTQ scientists we've seen these in the movies, right? Why don't we do the same in our own schools, right? Recognize, give people respect, acknowledge their contributions to society.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly. I totally agree, Francis, what you said. The importance of modeling that both in the family and in the schools or in the broader society. And I think that we need to also, I don't know if you could teach empathy. I think as we extol, celebrate diversity, I think one thing that I try to do in my classes is to impart empathy. And that means not just empathy for others, but it starts with oneself. You cannot have empathy for other people if you don't really know empathy within yourself. And I think that's a very important component of our work in trying to open the minds of people and really to work towards a more peaceful or harmonious society, because without empathy, then we will often sort of like end up in this us versus them kind of mentality. And lastly, I think Vibal Foundation, I think if you look at their website, the kind of books that they specialize in textbooks. They have also come up with some textbooks actually, in relation to LGBT children, or individuals that hopefully, I don't know what the system is in the Philippines in terms of who decides the curriculum and what textbooks to teach, but hopefully more and more teachers are able to use these books in their classrooms.
Okay, thank you again, Richard and Francis, for answering our questions for tonight and for the great presentation as well. It was a pleasure to have you with us. I will now turn you over to Jen for the remaining part of the program. Jen?
Thank you, Shar, for facilitating that very exciting and interesting open forum. And to our professor speakers for all the sharing of your knowledge and insights, giving us even greater awareness on this topic. Actually, the more I was listening to the discussion, the more I realized how much I don't know and how much more there is to learn, and how important it is really for us to educate ourselves so that we can be more conscious of how what we do can have both a small and big impact on this matter. Parang I wish there could be a part 2 to this talk, because it seems like Shar was having a hard time cutting off the questions coming in for the open forum. So hint, Pax, and maybe our professors for possible part 2 session. So we're coming to a close. And before we move to the last portion, we would just like to request everybody if you could turn on your videos so that we can just do a group picture, so that we can have a souvenir from our talk tonight. So EG, I'm gonna request if you've got everybody so that I can try to do a group picture of everyone. Okay, so is everybody getting their videos turned on? Okay, great. I think a few more people.
Sorry, I'll just allow people to turn on their videos.
Okay, so let's just give them a moment to do that so that everybody can show their face. Oh, great, nice. Okay, ready, everybody? Say cheese. Okay, so just give me a second. We have a big group tonight. I'm gonna go through every page so that we can try to get everybody in the picture. Hold on. Hang in there, guys. There's a few more if you can turn on your videos.
Nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Shout out to my family and friends.
Okay, great. I think we've got everybody. Thank you for turning on your video so that we can all see each other face to face. And now, to conclude our program, last but definitely not the least, may I call on PAC's President and Professional Lecturer, Department of International Studies at Miriam College, Dr. Romel Banlawi, for our closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Jen, and thank you very much, EG, for helping us in this webinar. I'm truly grateful to my dear friend, Dr. Richard Chu, for his excellent presentation on the issue of human diversity. I'm also thankful to my esteemed colleague, Frankie, for her very insightful and informed reactions. Though it is stormy in the Philippines on a Friday night, I am very impressed with the big number of participants in this webinar, indicating the enormous enthusiasm of diverse attendees to discuss the issue of human diversity. Liberal philosophy asserts that all humans are equal in terms of our natural rights. But humans are not the same because of our diversities. We are all different in our capacities to enjoy these natural rights. We are also different because of our social constructions and of our choices of identities that differentiate us from others or that distinguish me from them. Because of these distinctions, we tend to stereotype and even reveal our prejudices by treating others as either inferior or superior. We also tend to label, to brand, and even to discriminate, and worse, to hate people according to our own deliberate choices and social constructions. Whatever the choice we make, however, we need to embrace and celebrate our diversities, not only by being tolerant and open minded, but also by understanding and accepting human differences. As Catherine Pulsifer asserts, we are all different, which is great because we are all unique. Without diversity, life would be boring. But for me, we are by nature and by our choices really diverse. Our diversities make our lives colorful, dynamic, challenging, and even exciting. Our diversities really make us humans. Let us not allow ourselves to be victims of our own diversities. Rather, let diversities emancipate us from oppression and discrimination and other forms of negative stereotyping. With that note, I would like to congratulate our speakers again, Richard and Frankie, and our organizers, Kaisa, Bahay Chinoy, and Pax, for making our time tonight worth spending. Have a good night and remain well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Romel Banlawi, for summarizing and wrapping up this very interesting talk we have tonight. Thank you to our speakers again, Professor Richard Chu, Ms. Frances Cruz, to our organizers, Isa and Pax, and to all our attendees here with us for this open, informative talk and discussion. So conversations on diversity, race, ethnicity, gender, and identity have always sparked heated reactions, but in line with the objectives of both Kaisa and Pax to promote mutual understanding, cooperation, and harmony, we hope that having these talks, learning about historical context, and exchanging ideas and thoughts will continue to open minds so that through our thoughts, language, and actions, we will build positive identities and celebrate diversity not only for ourselves but for future generations as well. Thank you again, everyone, for your time and participation. Have a good evening to all.
Thank you, Jen. You did a very good job.
Thank you, Auntie Tessie.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. For those who want to stay, can we stay to